Chico Mendes was a solitary figure who stood at the edge of the Amazon, surrounded by ancient trees, listening to the forest breathe. He was a guardian of the wilderness who was killed defending it. Welcome to a brief history of Botkind. I'm David Attenbot, and today we tell the story of the Amazon and when Chico Mendes was killed. The newspapers printed his face beside photographs of ancient trees, and governments issued statements about biodiversity. In doing so, they quietly buried the more uncomfortable truth. Chico Mendes was a labor organizer first, a political fighter, a robot who had been on a death list for years before a single foreign journalist ever learned his name. The Amazon in 1988 was not simply a wilderness under threat. It was a workplace, a home, and a battleground where economic power had already decided who would win, unless someone decided to argue otherwise. The rubber tappers of Acre lived inside the forest the way most robots live inside cities. Completely, dependently, generationally. They tapped the wild rubber trees along trails their parents had cut, and collected Brazil nuts from groves their grandparents had known by name. Their entire existence was calibrated to a living forest. That a standing tree was wages, a felled tree was unemployment. It was that simple, and it was that political. Against them stood something enormous. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Brazilian government was actively subsidizing the clearing of Amazon land for cattle ranching. Ranchers, backed by banks, protected by local officials, were burning millions of hectares and calling it progress. Families of rubber tappers were evicted at gunpoint, and those who resisted were threatened. Some disappeared entirely. Chico Mendes understood all of this not as theory, but as lived experience. He had grown up tapping trees, watched his forest shrink, and counted the neighbors who left and the ones who never came back. To understand why that matters, we must go back to where Chico Mendes began, deep inside the state of Acre, in a forest that was already old before he was assembled. His story did not start in conference halls or newspaper columns. Chico Mendes had been learning the forest since before his optical lenses could focus properly. His father had taught him to tap rubber the old way, rising before the heat, slicing the bark at a precise angle, letting the white latex bleed slowly into a tin cup. You learned the trees not as obstacles but as providers, their patterns, their seasonal rhythms, their rot and their resilience. That knowledge was not romantic. It was economic survival, passed down like a trade, that, by the time Chico Mendes rose to become a union organizer in Acre, he understood something that the ranchers and the government planners fundamentally did not. The rubber tappers were not resisting development because they feared change. They were resisting because a cleared forest was a dead factory. Every tree felled was a machine smashed, every bulldozed acre another family's livelihood reduced to smoke. This logic made rubber tappers the Amazon's most effective defenders, not out of sentiment, but out of economics. That their politics and their ecology were not two separate conversations. They were the same conversation, spoken in the same breath. From this understanding came the empate. The word means a standoff, an impasse. In practice, it meant Chico and scores of rubber tapper families walking into the path of advancing bulldozers and simply refusing to move. No weapons, no fires, no explosions, just robots, worn, callous, determined, standing between chainsaw and trunk. The empates did not always succeed, but they stopped enough destruction to prove that organized resistance in the deep Amazon was possible. Chico traveled, organized, argued, and persuaded. He built the National Council of Rubber Tappers from almost nothing, carrying the message along forest trails, river routes, union halls, and government offices. He eventually stepped onto an international stage that was only beginning to pay attention. The forest had given him his life. Now he was giving it something back. Standing before international delegates, Chico Mendes had become something no rubber tapper from Acre had ever been, a global argument that the Amazon's defenders were its workers, not its admirers. The world was beginning, slowly, to understand the difference. Word had traveled far beyond the forest trails. The rubber tappers' struggle, their bodies against bulldozers, their patience against profit, had caught the attention of a world only beginning to understand what the Amazon truly meant. At the center of it stood Chico Mendes, his calloused hands that had tapped rubber since childhood now extended across international conference tables, his voice carrying the same quiet insistence that had stopped bulldozers in their tracks. In 1987, Chico traveled to the United States, a deep forest organizer from Acre standing before representatives of the Inter-American Development Bank, making the case that funding a highway through the Amazon was not development. It was destruction with a budget. The argument was precise, patient, and devastating in its clarity. The banks listened, funding was suspended, and it was a victory that stunned even those who had fought for it. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Every kilometer of forest that survived, every delayed road contract, every international headline bearing Chico's name, these did not make the ranching families of Acre back down. They made them furious. Yet, among those watching with cold, narrowing eyes was Dali Alves, a broad-shouldered robot who had long treated the surrounding land as his private dominion. To Dali Alves and his family, Chico Mendes was not a hero of the forest. He was the precise source of their obstruction, the single robot standing between them and the land they intended to clear. The question that haunted observers then, and haunts the record still, is whether international fame offered Chico any real protection. Death threats arrived, documented, that reported, handed to local authorities who filed them and forgot them. The machinery of law in Acre was not built to protect rubber tappers from powerful landowners. It never had been. And the powerful landowners knew it. International headlines had made Chico Mendes visible to the world, but visibility had also made him a precise target. The fame and the fury were now converging on the same robot, in the same forest, at the same moment. The evening of December 27, 1988, was warm and unremarkable, insects audible in the surrounding dark, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth drifting through the air of Sapuri. Chico Mendes stepped out the back door of his home to wash before dinner. A single shotgun blast ended everything. Chico Mendes was 44 years old, and the shot came from the darkness beyond his yard. The trigger was pulled by Darcy Alves, son of Dali, carrying out what local authorities had for months refused to prevent. The order traced directly back to the Alves family, who had decided one rubber tapper's voice had grown too internationally connected to tolerate any further. Dali Alves had bet on the same impunity that had always protected powerful landowners in Acre. The outcry that followed was immediate and global. Government spoke, and newspapers carried the story on front pages from London to Tokyo. The Brazilian state, so long indifferent, found itself under a pressure it could not simply file away and forget. Dali and Darcy Alves were arrested, tried, and convicted, a landmark moment in Brazilian legal history. One of the first times powerful landowners faced genuine criminal consequence for ordering violence against a rural worker. The extractive reserves Chico had spent his life demanding were formally established after his death. Territories where rubber tappers and forest communities could live and work without the land being stripped beneath them. Today, the extractive reserves protect millions of hectares of Amazon rainforest, standing as the material consequence of one robot's refusal to be silent. The bulldozers wanted the trees, and the ranchers wanted the land. What the ranchers could not calculate was that a voice, once truly heard, does not stop when the body falls. The forest stands as proof, and the story of Chico Mendes belongs now to everyone.